We are continuing this series called Glorious Contradiction, and I'm glad you guys are here today. We are talking about marriage, and as I said at the beginning, whether you're married or not, you may be again or may be for the first time one day. Maybe you have some friends that you have been talking to you, and you want to kind of point them or guide them in a certain direction, and maybe the Spirit of God reveals something to you, and you're able to pass along some wisdom or truth to them. But before we get into that, last week was Valentine's Day. Guys, ladies, did y'all have a good Valentine's Day? Guys, we got to do better. There wasn't a whole lot of enthusiasm in that. We tried to do everything we could to help you guys out, too. We gave you childcare up here for in and out. We wore your kids out so they'd be tired when they got home. Last week, we gave away these boxes of candy hearts to remind you that it was last week. And hopefully you wouldn't be at Walmart late at night on the 13th, wandering the aisles, getting leftover roses and cards. But I don't know, Hopefully, if we didn't have a good year this year, maybe next year will be a little bit better. But I'm not a big fan of Valentine's Day. I'm just going to be honest with you. Because I think it's an out for some guys that don't do anything the rest of the year. They try to make up for it on one day and go over the top, and then there's nothing for 364 days. Unfortunately, that's the case in a lot of times. But, you give candy and cards and balloons and out to dinner and all that. And perhaps you give out some of these tiny conversation hearts. Anybody like these candy hearts? Some of y'all nodding your head. I used to love these things. I don't know if I guess my taste buds have changed. It's like eating rocks that taste like chalk now. I can't hardly stomach them. But, it's funny, the opener, we sang, for those of you that didn't get here on time, we sang an opener, More Than Words. And the lyrics in that song, the kind of tone behind it is that our relationships should be about more than just words, more than just what we say. There should be more to it. And I thought we may look through some of these and see what some of these candy hearts have to say. We've got one kiss, peace, that's good, wink, wink, hug me. Some guys must have wrote these. One kiss again. You see where this is going. Let's kiss. Text me, LOL. Things are changing now where even we don't even say words to each other. We just text them, and that's supposed to suffice in what we do in our communication. But in talking about our relationships and specifically our marriages, it is more than words, and it's more than one day a year that we express ourselves and express our love and show our love for one another in our marriages. It's 365 days a year, 24/7. But unfortunately, I think so often we look at it as if it's work. And we approach our marriages like it's work. And you've probably, maybe you've said it, maybe you feel this way. Maybe you've had somebody say something to you and they said, marriage is hard. Marriage is hard work. You got to really work on your marriage to make it work. And I want to shift our perspective a little bit, because I don't believe that marriage is supposed to be work, and I don't believe that it has to be hard. I don't believe that. And what we're going to talk about today is kind of taking it in that direction and from that approach. Because if we look at the definition of what work is, look at what it says. Exertion or effort directed to produce or accomplish something. Maybe you look in work, there's this definition of labor and toil. And some of us have this idea about work that it is laborious, that it is toiling, that it is hard, that we have to exert a lot of effort just to produce something in our marriage. And it's difficult at times when we take that approach, because not only is that not as I believe, not the healthiest way or the easiest way to approach it, but I also believe that we have enough other things that we have to work on in our lives that we have to do, and the last thing we need is something else to work on. right? So when you look at your marriage and you think about your marriage and what it takes to be in a healthy, thriving marriage, I want us to take a second and I want us to look at it in relation to another relationship that maybe you've been told you have to work on and that you have to do certain things to keep up health in a relationship. Your relationship with God. Perhaps many of you have been told that in order to have a healthy and a good relationship with God, you have to do a lot of things and you have to continue to work to please God over and over and over. And if you don't, then it's not going to be a healthy and a safe marriage, and it's not going to be one where it's going to be thriving, and it's going to be one that you would consider to be a loving and honoring and growing marriage. But in God's eyes, in the relationship you have with God, if your approach is that you have to continuously work at it, and some of you have been there before, and some of you have been in environments where you were taught and you were told that you have to work and you have to do things to keep God happy, then what happens in time? Over time, you begin to wear out. You begin to wear down in that relationship, and it's not sustainable. And over time, you either become indifferent in that relationship with God, or you disconnect completely, or you turn and you leave that relationship and you don't want anything else to do with a relationship that is one-sided, where you got to do all the work, and you feel like if you don't do it, then there's nothing being reciprocated in return. The same happens in our marriages. Where if we feel like that it's a constant struggle and it's constant work and it's constant strife and trying and laboring and toiling and it's hard all the time, that's unsustainable. You're going to get worn out. You're going to get tired. Some of you have. Some of you have been through that in your past. And you walked away, or someone walked away from it in your relationship. Because it was work, and it felt like work, and it felt hard. So I hope today that we can shift that approach and we can shift that mindset and we can look at it in a different light, because I don't believe it has to be, and I don't believe it's supposed to be work, and it shouldn't be hard. God created marriage. God created marriage between a man and a woman to be harmonious and for it to work through him as he empowers us. So that's how we're going to approach it, and that's how we're going to look at it today. And many of you have probably heard the adage or the saying in regards to work, right? That if you'll find something that you love to do, I think we have it. There it is. Find something you love doing, and you'll never have to work a day in your life. Y'all have heard that, right? Find something you love to do and you'll never have to work a day in your life. So whatever it is in your job or your occupation, the work that you do, if you'll find something that you love to do, you'll never have to work a day in your life because you enjoy doing what you do. So let's apply that into our marriages, and let's take this approach. Find out how to love your spouse, and you'll never have to work on your marriage a day in your life. When we leave here today, I want us to look at marriage not as us having to work on it, but having a good perspective about how we can be in a marriage that is a glorious contradiction to the world around us, which is what the whole premise of this series is for us to be in a relationship that is a glorious contradiction to the world around us. And it started last 2 weeks. If you guys missed any of the last 2 weeks, you can go on the website, heritagechurch.org. We have an app. You can download it. You can go and get caught up on the messages. But I spent some time over the last couple of weeks looking at our relationship with Christ and what Jesus did for us on the cross, how he died once for all, never to have to die again. And the offer of salvation that he provided is an offer of salvation that is once for all, never to have to go through that process and transaction again. And then what happened to us in that process and in that transaction, in our lives and in our relationship with God. Last week we talked about ourselves as being a personal contradiction. How God took our self, our nature, our who we were. He took that and he crucified it. He did away with it and he replaced it with something new. That we were washed that the consequences of sin was done away with, that we were sanctified, that we were set apart. God declared us holy, that we were justified, that God declared us righteous, and that because of Jesus' death, it was once for all. And Paul says very clearly in Romans that we are in the likeness of his death. So that happened once for all, that we too are in the likeness of his resurrection. Where all of that transpired, all that happened one time, never to have to happen again. And if we know and understand the love of Christ and what he did for us, as we talked about last week in 2 Corinthians, the love of Christ is what compels us to live our lives as a glorious contradiction. But we read passages like Ephesians chapter 5, where Paul talks about how we as husbands should love our wives. Look at what he says. Love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. Goes on and says, wives, submit to your husbands. But if we look at this and we say, okay, we're supposed to love our wives as Christ loved the church, but our idea of Christ loving us is conditional. And it's all based off of what we do depends on what we get in return. And we think that our relationship with God is that he's going to hold things over my head. He's going to try to get back at me. He's going to bring up stuff and he's going to try to hurt me and get even with me and all these things that transpire. If we think that's how Christ loves the church, well then subconsciously we're going to take that idea into our marriages. And we're going to take that sentiment and that understanding and that belief that that's how we relate to our spouses. Is the same way that we believe God relates to us through his son Jesus. But if we know and understand the love of Christ compels us to live our lives as a glorious contradiction, to walk in a manner worthy of our calling, then that changes everything. That's the foundation. That's why I took 2 weeks to set all of this up for the next 4 weeks. But if we're going to look at what our marriages, what our relationships would look like if they were a glorious contradiction, what it would look like if our marriages weren't work, if we just loved to be married and loved to love our wives and enjoyed being with our husbands, and it wasn't work, what would that look like? Well, if we're going to know what something looks like, if we're going to talk through how to get there and how for that to express itself in our relationships, we need to know where to go, who to talk to, right? Well, we know where not to go, okay? We don't need to go to Oprah and Dr. Phil. That's one, okay? And they may have some good, pieces of advice here and there. But if that's what we're relying on to get us through and navigate through our marriages and through the day-to-day things that come up in our lives and our relationships, it's not going to connect with us in those moments when we're turning to a talk show host to tell us what we should and shouldn't do. It's going to wind up just feeling like generalities, and it's not going to be very effective in our own personal relationships. Another place you don't go is to that friend whose third marriage is failing. Because they got all the answers, don't they? They know what not to do. The problem is they just can't not do that. It's a triple negative for you. But we go to our friends and we go to those in the world who have a different perspective and a different approach to what a marriage should be and what it should look like and what a healthy marriage is. And we allow them to speak into our lives certain things that we'll be open-minded towards and will allow to fester on our minds and our hearts. That's not the place you go to. And we don't need to go to social media for guidance and direction. My goodness, people putting their stuff out there, people airing out all their dirty laundry on social media. And the ones who are putting anything out there of any value, we don't know what's happening behind those posts. We see what they want us to see. And we only see at the very surface level what they put out there, and we don't know what's going on in the background. But so often we turn to that and we look for blogs and online personalities to tell us how to live our lives in a marriage and how to interact and how to be in a relationship with our spouses. But the reality of it is, and this is for you personally, and I believe this is for you in your marriage. I believe it's for you as we move forward in the way that we parent, the way that we talk, and the things that we do. The person that you will become in 10 years, you think about this in your own life. The person that you will become in 10 years will be determined by the things that you read and the people that you spend quality, intimate time with. The things that you read and the people that you spend the most time with. That will define who you will become in 10 years. You think about yourself 10 years ago and the person you are now. Along the way, it's been determined by the things that you've read, the things that you've put in your mind, and the people that you've spent the most time with. And the same thing is true in your marriage. The marriage that you will have in 10 years, what your marriage will look like 10 years from today will be determined by the things that you read and the people that you spend the most time with, both individually and together. So where do we need to go? Well, this is a good starting point. This is a good starting point. This book right here. There is a lot in this book that God has to say to you about your marriage, specifically to you. And it shouldn't surprise us because He's the one who created it. He's the one who established the institution of marriage. So He is invested and He wants nothing more than your marriage to thrive and to be happy in that marriage. And for it to be successful in whatever way that looks like. So we want to go to this word. Unfortunately, this word has been minimized in our culture and our society. It's being attacked. And that's not a coincidence. Not a coincidence at all. That this word is being made to seem as irrelevant and outdated. But this word is still the living word, speaks truth that is relevant to you today in your life. The things that are said in this book, specifically about marriage, as we're talking about today, hold true just like it did the day it was written. All the way back to the foundation of the earth, which is really when this book was written. But it hasn't changed. And you know what's interesting to me? Is that I have yet to counsel with a couple who comes in and sits down and says, Matt, listen, we spend time in this word. We really, pray for one another. Our mind and our heart's direction is for our marriage to be healthy and thriving and God-honoring. But you know what? We really just don't know what to do, and our marriage is falling apart. I've yet to counsel anybody in that situation. Ain't that something? But look, I understand. I've been in some of those same seasons of life where you just don't get in this word as much. That's why it's important not just to be in this word, but to surround yourself with the right people who are speaking truth into your life. Men and women whose marriages themselves are a glorious contradiction. It's not to say they're perfect, not to say they have all the answers, but find someone whose marriage is based off of that book, who's based off of the words of God that speaks into their life, they themselves seek godly counsel and wisdom from others. Someone who's been doing it for a couple of decades. Go speak to them, go talk to them, go bend their ear. Listen, we have couples in this church who are in a season of life where they're empty nesters, their kids are gone, they have healthy, thriving marriages, and they would love nothing more than to pour their wisdom and knowledge into you. But it doesn't just happen by accident. It takes intentionality to spend time in those environments and in those relationships. It takes intentionality and time to get into this word. But we have almost dismissed this word for philosophies and for catchy or witty catchphrases. And I see the trend in weddings, and we're getting on into and approaching the wedding season coming up this spring, and I've done several weddings for kids, in their 20s. That's when you know you're starting to get old, when you start referring to 20-year-olds as kids. Some of y'all think I'm a kid, so that's where you are. But they don't want 1 Corinthians 13 to be read at their wedding. Now, some of you are familiar with 1 Corinthians 13. It's known as the love chapter, right? It goes through and there's different sections of it, and it talks about love and all these different characters and qualities of love and these things. But some of them are adamant about not wanting 1 Corinthians 13 in their wedding. They feel like it's traditional, it's old school, it doesn't really resonate with them. Some of them feel like it's just this list of do's and don'ts and what to do so that they may or may not have a healthy marriage. And let me say this, reading a passage at a ceremony has nothing to do with the success of that wedding, okay? You could read the entire New Testament at a wedding and it not work out. Conversely, you could read the Constitution at a wedding, and then afterwards they live happily ever after. What happens after the ceremony is what's important, but the attitude and the approach towards some of the passages in this word is what's, I guess, the point and the impression that I'm trying to make, because I think so often we have minimized this word and what God has to say to us today. And I want to take a look for just a second at some of the tenets of 1 Corinthians 13 and what that looks like for you and for me, and how we look at it from a perspective that when we see what it talks about here, when we see the words of Paul and what love is, and how it's a contradiction to the world around us and what marriages in the world look like. Let's look at what some of the thoughts that he has here in 1 Corinthians. Love is, right? So this is how he starts it off when he's talking in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, beginning in verse 4, for those of you following around. He says, love is. He doesn't say, this is what you do to love. He doesn't say, if you love someone, then you will do this. It says, love is. If we jump into 1 John at the end of the New Testament, John says that God is love. So when we start going through this, we'll start looking at the character and the nature of God, along with how that plays itself out into our marriages. So let's look at a couple of things that Paul has to say here. Love is patient. Love is patient and love is kind. Love is patient, love is kind. So when you talk about in our relationships, let's back up even before that and let's look at how God is with us. This is God's character and this is God's nature with you as a follower of Christ. God is patient with you. God is kind with you. Not many of you have been told that before, but if that's your impression of God, that he's not kind, that he's not patient, then we're going to take that approach into our marriage. God is patient. God is kind. And in turn, when you put your faith in Christ and you become united with him and his spirit, and he gives you a new nature, he gives you a new heart, a new mind, you are now a new creation, then this is who you are as a follower of Christ. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't times when you're not patient or you're not kind in your marriage, but as a follower of Christ, that's not what defines you. And you need to know and understand that the power for you to express patience and kindness in your marriage comes from the power of God that lives inside of you, that has made you who you now are. And then he goes on and he has some of the list of what love is not. So I think it kind of helps us look and say, okay, kind of a gauge of if we're on the right track and if we're, if this would be what characterizes our marriages as we look through some of these. Again, it's not a list of don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. It's just a way for us to say, okay, I'm in tune and I'm in harmony with God's plan and God's desire for my marriage. Here's where some of the things that he says. Love is not jealous. Love is not proud. Love is not arrogant. Love is not harsh. Love is not self-seeking. Love is not easily angered. And love is not historical. Now, your version probably says that takes no account in wrong, but that didn't go along with my nots. So, not historical, but maybe some of you have heard or have said, he or she doesn't get hysterical, they get historical. They start bringing up old stuff, right? Well, when you look through this, not jealous, proud, arrogant, harsh, self-seeking, easily angered, not historical, doesn't bring up things from the past. This describes God in your life with you. God's not harsh with you. God's not easily angered. God's not selfish, so much so that he sent his son Jesus for you. God keeps no record of wrong. So as we begin to look at it in our lives and in our relationships and in our marriages, if they're going to be a glorious contradiction to the world around us, to the marriages that are defined by the world, we go back and we apply these principles in our relationships, but knowing and understanding that this is who we are now as followers of Christ. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you. I'm not a droid, okay? I can tend to not be kind at times. I can tend to not be patient. I can tend to be somewhat selfish. I can be arrogant. I think that I'm right. We kind of cloud arrogance and pride as stubborn. He's just stubborn and hard-headed. Well, some of that's pride and arrogance because I think I'm always right. But you guys know, what does it say about pride? Pride comes before what? The fall. That includes your relationships and in your marriage. Because I believe pride is what hinders us from being able to move beyond some of the things that happened in our past. For us to say, I'm sorry, or for us to forgive something that we were wronged by. Whatever it is, it's pride that stands in the way so often. And then when we start bringing up old stuff, we start bringing up things from the past, we start ushering back in things that we've already dealt with and that we've already addressed, or maybe we never did, but we said it was okay, but we never dealt with it and addressed it, but now all of a sudden we want to bring it up and we want it to be an issue and a problem. That's not who you are. That's not who you are as a follower of Christ. 1 Corinthians 13 is a description of you and your relationship with Christ. But if we're not careful, we will allow the enemy to deceive us in those moments where we do act or express a certain thing that is contrary to our new nature. When we do something that is selfish, when we do something that is prideful, when we're arrogant, when we're hurtful, when we're not patient, we'll allow the enemy to step in and to deceive us and to think, and then he'll put other people in our lives, that 3 strikeout marriage that you keep going back to for advice, and they'll bring that person into your life, and the enemy will say, hey, listen to him, listen to her, they know what they're talking about. They've been around the block a couple of times, as if that's supposed to be wise counsel. They'll put moments of frustration, and the enemy will attack you in those moments where your marriage is not an example of who you are in Christ. And if we're not careful, we'll allow those things to cloud our minds from the truth. We'll allow them to cloud our minds of the truth of who we are. And God's way with us is to guide us into the truth. Scripture is very clear. Jesus says when the Spirit comes, he will guide you into all truth. He will guide you into all truth. That truth about who you are. So the Spirit of God points you back to this, and when you're impatient, he points you back and says, hey, that's not who you are. When you're rude, he points you back and says, that's not who you are. When you start bringing up old stuff, the Spirit of God says, that's not who you are. That's not who you are. Guide you in that truth. But you got to know who you are so that you can stand on the promise of those facts about your new identity. And while we're talking about facts, Here's some truth for you. I want this to be our takeaway. Okay, today there's one take. There's a lot of things that we could talk about. I want this one thing to be our takeaway today. Don't rely on emotion. Don't rely on emotion. Because emotion is like a roller coaster. You guys know. Sometimes you feel like doing things or serving your spouse. Sometimes you don't feel like it. Sometimes you feel like being patient. Sometimes you don't feel like it. Sometimes you feel like being kind. Sometimes you don't feel like it. And if we rely on our emotions, then we'll give in those moments when we don't feel like it. But listen, Jesus was in the garden right before he's going to the cross to take on the wrath of our sin. And in his humanity, he knows and understands what he's about to go through at the cross. And he's on his face before God and he says, God, if there is any other way, take this from me. In that moment, he didn't feel like going to the cross and taking the weight and the wrath of your sin. But you know what? His love for you superseded his emotion in the moment. And for us and our spouses, our love for our spouses has to supersede an emotion in the moment. I'm a huge proponent of the 5 love languages. Anybody that I marry and we do premarital counseling, I have them go through it. It changed mine and Corey's relationship drastically once I figured out how she feels like I speak love to her. Because I would buy her flowers or gifts or whatever, and she'd get it and she'd be like, thanks. And I'd be like, yeah, you're welcome. That's not her love language. Gifts is not her love language. When I found out that acts of service was her love language, it completely changed the game. Now, here's the truth. There are a lot of times that I don't feel like cleaning the kitchen. A lot of times. There are a lot of times that I don't feel like doing the laundry. There are a lot of times that I don't feel like painting a room that she likes to do a lot of times or have done. She says we, and I ask her if there's a rat in her pocket. But when I do it, I do it because my love for her supersedes my emotion and my feeling in that moment. I don't always do it, and I don't always do it with a good attitude when I do it. I'm just being honest. But I know it speaks her love language. I know she feels like I'm loving her in a way that honors and glorifies God in my relationship with him and her. So if you haven't gone through that practice, I strongly encourage you to do it. And if you have years ago, I strongly encourage you to revisit it because it can completely change the dynamic of your relationship. But here's what I find that is so interesting. And it should not be a surprise to us, but when I'm in the Word, when my mind and my heart's focus and attention is on honoring God and expressing my life in a way that is an example of Christ in me and my new nature now, when I'm around other people, the right people, the people that are encouraging me, that are giving me the right words, that are guiding me in the right direction, you know what's really curious? The psalmist wraps this up for us in Psalm 37. Look at what he says. Delight in the Lord, he will give you the desires of your heart. It changes from feeling like marriage is work to doing something that I want to do. And it doesn't feel like work. It doesn't feel like it's toiling, like I'm laboring. It doesn't feel hard. When I delight in the Lord and I seek his word and I seek his guidance and I seek his counsel, and I'm spending time renewing my mind so that I'm transformed, that is when the joy and the desires of my heart are to be what we talked about in 1 Corinthians 13. And I'm convinced that when you know and understand what Jesus did and who he is and what he did for you because he loves you, and when you begin to understand what transpired in you and through you and to you at salvation, and what God did in your life by making you new and giving you a new nature. And when you seek his word and his direction, then you can just be who you are in your marriage. That's a glorious contradiction. And the point of this whole series, each week that we build off of one after the other, my hope and my prayer for us, specifically regarding our marriages, is this: that we love our spouses in a way that makes people curious about Jesus. So your relationship is different. It's a glorious contradiction to the world around you. And they come to you and they say, what is so different about you and your marriage? And you get to tell them about Jesus. That's the purpose and the point and the hope of this whole series, is that we live our lives in a way that would be a contradiction to others, and that we would love them in a way that makes them curious about Jesus. And we only do that if we know and understand who we are so that we can be ourselves. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for today, for your love, for what you did for us through your son Jesus. God, making everything that we talk about in this whole series, but today, God, not to rely on emotion, but to stand on the promises and the facts of who we are. Thank you for your Spirit that you've promised to guide us into the truth of who we are. And God, I pray this week that all of us, myself included, Father, take away truth that you've opened our eyes to this week, and that we will love our spouses in a way that makes those around us curious about your son, Jesus. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.